Great. Okay, thank you very much. I'll just first, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I really enjoyed looking at the exhibition over lunch and seeing some of the designers that I've written about and interviewed. And then it was kind of really fun to see Mimi's image with the Herero woman, which I just taught last week in my art and colonialism class. So this is all very interconnected. So I'll get started. Fashion, in my view, is best described as changing styles of dress and other body adornment that are motivated by the social value placed on innovation. One key source of inspiration for changing styles of dress is exploration beyond one's geographic and/or chronological context, as we've just seen. In addition to novelty and aesthetic preferences, other predispositions motivate the adaptation of dress forms across geographical or temporal divides, including the desire to draw on these forms' personal, political, and/or historical associations. Using 3 very diverse case studies, I will explore this drive to innovate, analyzing contexts and inspirations that flow between and beneath cultures, with Africa as the central node in these global networks. Philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah's conceptualization of cosmopolitanism illuminates African fashion's global tendencies as well as its cultural specificity. Appiah proposes cosmopolitanism as an alternative to globalization, a term that he argues has come to refer to the broad flows of capital, culture, and information rather than to the human experience of these flows. Clothing features prominently in Appiah's description of the image that the term cosmopolitan brings to mind, an image he seeks to challenge. And I quote from him his description of the cosmopolitan: "You imagine a comme des garçons clad sophisticate with a platinum frequent flyer card regarding with kindly condescension a ruddy-faced farmer in workman's overalls," end quote. Rejecting this parody of high and low styles of dress, which separates the two into completely distinct cultural domains, Appiah calls for a return to the term's original, and he suggests more fruitful connotation, which emphasizes contact rather than difference. These connections are vividly manifested in fashion design, where elite brands like Paris-based Comme des Garçons, founded by a Japanese designer, might well draw inspiration from workmen's overalls, Indian saris, and African textiles, just as I will demonstrate that African fashion innovators may draw inspiration from Comme des Garçons, from India, from distant parts of Africa, or from their own cultural roots. The absorption of new fashion influences across cultures exemplifies a process that Appiah labels contamination. In his conception, contamination enriches cultures, offering a model of cultural exchange that values transformation rather than preservation. Quote, Appiah's words, "When people speak for an ideal of cultural purity, sustaining the authentic culture of the Ashanti or the American family farm, I find myself drawn to contamination as the name of a counter-ideal." Appiah again turns to cloth and clothing to describe the products of contamination. Quote, "The textiles most people think of as traditional West African cloths are known as Java prints and arrived with the Javanese batiks sold and often milled by the Dutch. And so with our own kente cloth," and he's from Ghana. "The silk was always imported, traded by Europeans, produced in Asia. This tradition was once an innovation." Through the stories of these textiles, both of which play key roles in contemporary Ghanaian dress practices, Appiah describes the complex distinctions and interactions between local and global, African and Western, tradition and innovation. All of these categories are fluid in fashion markets, a key location for the cross currents of contamination from south to north, north to south, and my focus here, from south to south. This paper is drawn from 2 chapters of my book published last year, African Fashion, Global Style. I bring together 3 case studies that illustrate the cross currents that are my focus. I'll begin with a mid-20th century innovation that vividly illustrates fashion production in these networks that I'm talking about that we might classify as trans-colonial in this case rather than transnational. This dress innovation, a style called Ghana Boy, and you're seeing a little piece of one here, was produced by the pressure placed on rural young men by the imposition of colonial taxation and monetary systems, and by the movement of products and images along networks created by colonial rule in far-flung regions. My second case study expands on Appiah's description of an omnipresent element of fashion in nearly every part of Africa, textiles known as Dutch wax prints, or just wax. Unlike Ghana Boy Tunics, this form has received attention from historians and other scholars. I'll simply summarize that history here. And I'll end with an analysis of dress innovation as a form of personal expression by an innovator inspired by her childhood memories of Africa and by her life in Africa's diaspora. First, the trans-African innovation. Embroidered tunics from Mali in a style known as Ghana Boy illuminate networks of images and ideas whereby styles are absorbed into local systems of meaning and transformed. These cotton tunics are adorned with embroidered figures, words, and abstract patterns. So these are tunics, you're looking at the front and back, and you see the neck hole on the front on the left. Their multinational history and iconography make Ghana Boy tunics difficult to classify. They are the products of an internal diaspora overlaid with colonial cultures. Local in neither their materials nor their iconography, yet these tunics reflect distinctively local practices and social systems. Although they appear to incorporate aspirational representations of Western commodities, technologies, and lifestyles, this garment emerges out of a series of networks that only occasionally intersects with Western imagery and meanings. Ghana Boy tunics were made from the 1960s to the 1980s by young Malian men while they were working temporarily in Ghana, hence the name Ghana Boy. The tunics are made of heavy cotton sheeting with bright cotton thread embroidery. The cloth and the thread were likely acquired in Ghana. The style and iconography developed out of the distinct perspective these young Malian men brought to their encounter with urban Ghana. Ghana Boy tunics are associated with the inland Niger Delta region of central Mali, just south of the Sahara Desert. The region has long been a crossroads of cultures. Labor migration from the inland savannas to Ghana and other countries is nothing new, but instead a continuation of a long history of connections across vast regions. The region remains a multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan. The Ghana Boy tunics have been made by young men from a variety of different ethnic groups in the inland Niger Delta region, including Dogon, Songhai, Fulani, and Bozo. One of the Ghana Boys, or former Ghana Boys I interviewed, who you see here, Kariba Bouare, who's based in Djenne, he is Songhai. He's also one of the few who continue to embroider in this style. Labor migration is a central aspect of livelihoods in this region. Young men, and less frequently women, from the region have long traveled to Bamako, Mali's capital, to neighboring countries, to France, and more recently to Libya, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. In the 1960s and 70s, Ghana was a major destination. As they traveled between Mali and Ghana, young men traversed linguistic, ecological, and colonial zones. The division of West Africa into French and British colonies created separate global networks that have endured long after African nations gained independence. Travel provided a means of seeking one's fortune, proving one's courage, and building status in the community. And clothing is a key means of visibly announcing the young man's experience abroad, laying claim to their new status in public arenas, such as in marketplaces. You see this photograph from the 1970s of young men wearing Ghana Boy tunics in the Djenne market. Embroidery, the medium used to transform these tunics, has great significance in the inland Niger Delta region. For most communities, embroidered garments are closely associated with specific forms of status that are tied to Muslim identity. In Timbuktu, one of the famous cities in this region, I worked with embroiderer Baba Jite and members of his atelier who create garments in a style that has a centuries-old history in the region, and he's wearing one of these garments here. These are the members of his atelier embroidering together, and this is the garment. It's called a tilbi. It's a kind of a gown or bubu that has long been associated with wealth and status that ideally results from piousness. While Ghana boy embroidery, we're seeing on the left, and that's a tilbi on the right, represents status that is associated with youth acquired abroad and not affiliated with Islam. Although these young men are Muslim, this is not an insignia of Muslim identity. Ghana boy tunics employ brilliant colors, while tilbi and other elite styles are extraordinarily subtle, in color. I've written elsewhere about the diverse sources of these innovative colors and patterns, and I won't go into that here, but kente cloth is one source of these patterns. But I focus here on the most dramatic innovation, the figurative imagery that adorns the Ghana boy tunics. Many of the young Malian migrants who went to Ghana in the 70s and 80s found work as night watchmen. This occupation would have given the young men a close-up view of the lives of middle-class Ghanaians. They depicted the elements of these lives that fascinated them: women in short skirts with legs crossed, elaborate motorcycles, street lights with their red, green, and yellow glow. Yet some of the tunic's embroidery clearly wasn't inspired by the streets and gardens of Accra or Kumasi. The chic attire of two equestrian figures, one with gun drawn on one tunic, appear to be more Hollywood fantasy than daily life. This is where the networks created by colonial history come into play. India and Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, were both parts of the British Empire, which created its own global connections. The products of one British colony were exported to others, so that Ghana had Bollywood films before Mali. The posters and films themselves might have been sources of fascination for young men unfamiliar with the genre, which was very popular all over West Africa by the 1970s. The apparently Western style of clothing of these figures, with bell-bottom pants, miniskirts, and halter tops, might not indicate any association with or aspiration for European or American lifestyles, but rather indicate a fascination with to these young men, exotic modernity depicted in Bollywood films. Similarly, Mantya Jawara's discussion of youth culture in 1960s Bamako asserts that Malian teenagers' adoption of James Brown and other American celebrities as their fashion models did not indicate a desire to emulate Western culture. It was rather part of the creation of something entirely new, using diverse sources filtered through the young people's own experiences. And these are famous photographs by Malian photographer Malik Sidibe. While Jawara addressed the specifically post-independence nature of Bamako youth's absorption of status symbols from afar, the Ghana boy phenomenon is part of a history of adventurous journeys that spans the pre- and post-independence eras. On their return home, wearing tunics adorned with these figures, young Malian men vividly advertised their experience of Ghana not only through images of Ghana itself, but through the faraway visions of Indian melodramas accessible through Ghana's popular cultures. I'll briefly now turn to a second instance of this kind of trans-African fashion innovation, which Appia employed as an illustration of the productive power of contamination. In the case of Dutch wax cloth, these interactions were initially mediated from the north, but the interactions can really be viewed as south-south, from the south to the south. Beginning with the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century, European markets developed a taste for batik fabrics, developed and made mostly in Java in Indonesia. The popularity of these resist-dyed fabrics these resistite fabrics in Europe led industrialists in Holland and the UK to seek a means of mass-producing similar textiles, early examples we see here, using roller prints, a technology that took hold in the mid-19th century. Their efforts failed to find markets in Europe, but African colonies provided a ready market. I'm just showing you here Holland, colonies in Indonesia, and then markets in West Africa. European producers soon began to produce textiles to the tastes of specific African regions, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Senegal, and so on. The batik aesthetic lives on in the imitation crackling you see here in the background. This is a hugely popular cloth still today in many West African markets. This is a cloth that is adorned with iconography that is specific to one part of West Africa. And also we see the deliberate mismatch of colors that's mass-produced but meant to imitate hand-stamped cloth. These textiles are now made in African as well as in European and Asian factories, and they've become emblems of African style in much of the continent. One of the most famous companies producing these textiles is Vlisco, and this is from one of their ads. And renowned artist Yinka Shonibare, many of you are probably familiar with him, uses the cloth to draw precisely on these complexities and contaminations to subvert the categories by which we organize people and cultures. So that's my second example. My third is designer Sakina Msa, who uses fashion to evoke very personal aspects of her own experience as an African woman in France. Msa was born and raised in the Union of the Comoros, an archipelago of 4 islands in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Mozambique. Her family moved to France when she was 7. The sense of dislocation from the place and the people of her childhood instilled in Msa a desire to reconnect with her heritage, a quest that is reflected in her work. Msa's unconventional approach to fashion design owes as much to her youth in Marseille as to her childhood in the Comoros. As a teenager in Marseille during the 1980s, Msa embraced the urban youth culture of the era, adopting punk style with its emphasis on a worn, handmade, anti-materialist aesthetic. She also studied art and developed a fascination with clothing as a medium that enabled her to combine her interests in poetry, music, and visual arts. As one example of her combination of all these realms, along with social action as a real passion, she inaugurated in 2010 the Blue Line, and we're seeing some of the clothes from that line here, which features clothing made of recycled fabrics in a single color, the vibrant blue that is associated with coveralls and other uniforms worn by municipal workers, construction crews, and laborers of all kinds in France. Msa described the Blue Line in social and aesthetic terms as, quote, an homage to these men of the shadows, these workers who create light for our society. My father is a worker, and I've always admired this worker's blue, which is very close to Yves Klein blue. Msa and her collaborators cut up overalls, pants, jackets, and shirts, assembling the pieces to create new garments, now for women, including dresses, coats, and bags. In 2009, Msa created a collection that exemplifies the complexities of her networks, of the networks that shape her imagination. These dresses, which Msa has referred to as femme giraffe or giraffe woman style, represent a very personal response to specifically African forms, cultures, and histories. Msa described the dresses as her revision of the characteristic woman's attire, that's another example from the line, of the Maasai, an East African ethnic group. The garments are an abstraction based on the Maasai woman's layers of beads, and they reflect her desire to pay homage to these women in a sober manner, likely in contrast to other refashionings of Maasai style, most notably John Galliano's flamboyant inventions, which we see here in a spread in W Magazine from '97. Her stylized giraffe, by way of Maasai beadwork, is thoroughly absorbed into her design vision, creating a very personal interpretation that refuses broad generalizations about Africa. Rows of beaded necklaces are, in Msa's garments, transformed into pillows that softly yet dramatically reshape the upper body. Msa thoroughly transforms her source of inspiration, preserving the beaded necklaces of the Maasai as shapes, creating wholly new forms that allow but do not demand interpretation. Msa has no direct connection with Maasai womanhood, beyond also being an East African woman. Yet she draws the Maasai into her own identity as an African woman. The giraffe dresses also echo a collection created by Japanese designer Rei Kawakubo for her brand Comme des Garçons. The Spring-Summer '97 collection called Dress Meets Body Meets Dress is more informally known as the Lumps and Bumps collection, and many of you are no doubt familiar with it. The nylon dresses incorporate down-filled pillows stitched into a thin sheath worn beneath the dress. The work of Kawakubo and other conceptual designers has been interpreted as a critique of the fashion trends of the 1980s. Comme des Garçons references are broad and highly theorized, while the designer's own biography is emphatically absent. Kawakubo rarely provides any information about her design processes or her sources of inspiration. Msa's femme giraffe dresses were in a sense made possible by this practice of fashion, yet her work, Msa's work, emerges from a drive to express her identity and directly engage with communities. Thus, these dresses might be viewed as the products of layered inspirations, from the Comoros to Marseille, on to Tanzania and Japan, all assembled in the world's ostensible fashion center, Paris. To draw all of these threads together, I return to Kwame Anthony Appiah's conception of the cosmopolitan, the resident of multiple worlds, connecting those worlds through processes of contamination, out of which emerge new productive forms that reflect changing contexts. We recall that Appiah employed clothing to parody the popular image of the cosmopolitan, imagined as a comme des garçons-clad sophisticate, the opposite of the ruddy-faced farmer in workman's overalls. Sakina Msa, whose work uses both overalls and comme des garçons, exemplifies Appiah's vision of the cosmopolitan, not as an enforcer of hierarchy, but rather as an agent of contamination. London-based, Nigerian-owned glossy fashion magazine Arise describes its readership using a term that is related to the cosmopolitan, transformed into a specifically African phenomenon. The magazine describes its target audience as, quote, a discerning Afropolitan readership who share an interest in the cultural and social developments coming out of the continent. The term Afropolitan refers to a new generation, people of African descent who live in Africa and elsewhere, accustomed to moving between cultures, languages, and homes. Afropolitans also think critically about what it means to be African in the midst of this in-betweenness. An essay by Tai Selassie is often cited as a key reference on Afropolitanism. Selassie, who herself exemplifies the concept as an Anglo-Ghanaian American, opens the essay with a description of a nightclub in London, using clothing to paint a picture. Quote, the whole scene speaks of the cultural hybrid. Kente cloth worn over low-waist jeans, African lady over ludicrous baselines, London meets Lagos meets Durban meets Dakar. Africa's many fashion manifestations add layers of complexity to this Africa-focused conception of the cosmopolitan. While Afropolitanism has been conceptualized as an African cultural phenomenon that traverses global cities in Africa, Europe, and North America, we have seen this cultural blending and this self-awareness of the cultural fusion, of the value of cultural fusion in the work of designers who are inspired by local or regional cultures, as well as by global cultural flows. I would contend, for example, that the makers of Ghana Boy Tunics were and are thoroughly Afropolitan in their sensibilities, though their innovations occurred decades ago. Moreover, the creators of Ghana Boy Tunics, along with Baba Jite and his forebearers, draw our attention to fusions and fashion innovations that emerge out of networks that do not rely on Europe or North America. So too does Sakina Msa, who makes Maasai beads and Japanese French fashion her own, as a means of exploring her own East African heritage. Afropolitans all, implicitly pushing the boundaries of categories such as African and traditional, using fashion to bypass those categories in favor of the creative force of contamination. Thank you. I will be happy to take questions or comments.
I have a question.
Sure.
In this vision of Afropolitan style, where do we put the problem of the appropriation of African design by Western designers, which is so ubiquitous? I know the Maasai are now trying to reclaim the right to their own symbolism, which has been so flagrantly ripped off by so many designers.
Right. No, it's a huge question. And to me, it's really a matter of power dynamics. And my earliest research in Africa was in Mali on a type of textile called bogolan fini, known in the US often as mudcloth. And I worked with lots of artists in Mali. It was really experiencing kind of a fluorescence of interest in this really traditional, deeply cultural embedded cloth. And all of a sudden, it was being printed onto wrapping paper by Hallmark, and it was being used by Parisian furniture manufacturers as upholstery. And so a lot of the artists who I was working with were very frustrated by this loss of control over an element of their cultural heritage. And I found in my research that in terms of the legalities and the economics of this system, it is nearly impossible for artists in Africa and in other parts of the world to maintain control over these elements of their heritage. So it has to be, this is an issue that really has to be addressed through the will of the people who are involved in these markets, because the legal system doesn't yet exist to protect people's rights to their cultural heritage. But it's a huge question, yeah, and an important one. Okay, thank you.